Now, in Module 3, we're going to talk about socialization effects of the cultural beliefs from Chapter 4. And with socialization, we're going to go into a little deeper dive in some of the concepts that I discussed a little bit earlier in Module 2. And so that is in the form of both broad and narrow socialization. So cultures are going to go ahead and define range and focus of acceptable personal variation within society. As you might imagine, broad's going to allow more of that variation, narrow, less of that variation. And so what they're going to do is differ in the degree of restrictiveness that they're going to impose. And in narrow socialization, there's going to be a lot more restrictiveness versus a broad one. So going back to the concept that we just talked about in Module 2, when we talk about narrow socialization, we're looking at more of a collectivistic mindset. Remember what's good for the group. And then in broad socialization, we're looking at more individualism. So what's good for the individual. So what's important to bear in mind here is that individualism, collectivism, and broad and narrow are not really meant to imply some sort of a moral evaluation. So there's not necessarily anything wrong with a narrow socialization, even though it's different from what maybe you see in the United States more so. Now, what or who kind of dictates these types of socialization are the people that we surround ourselves with. And there's various people and institutions that can influence our view of socialization in our culture. And so what we see here is that these are the various sources of socialization. So you can see on the slide here, peers and friends obviously have a big role. What your school teaches you, how the community reacts to things, the workplace that you end up in, what the legal system values, what media sends out, the messages, of course, family, and then an overall cultural belief system. Now, when you're young, what you begin to see is that places like your friends and especially your family tend to have a lot of influence over your belief. But what we begin to see is a decrease in some of these over time, in particular in regards to family and its sort of influence over an adolescent. So early on in adolescence, families probably do have quite a bit of influence, but as you see in the mid-adolescence and going later, as they become more independent, friends, media, school, all that begins to increase in its influence, and you begin to see a diminishing of the family as a source of importance. Now, that's just a generality in regards to us here in a more westernized society or here in the United States. Now, one example of a narrow socialization that occurs in a different culture is what was called the law. And the law is based in Aboriginal Australia. And so for many generations, these Australian Aborigines had a ritual where they taught the children and adolescents their cultural values and what they referred to as the law. And the law, in this case, gave a lot of the morality for that society and also taught people how do you conduct interpersonal relationships like marriage and friendship and what's an acceptable way to engage in those. It also gave an overall belief of how their world began. And that common belief of how the world begins is a uniting factor for that community as part of their law. And then there were instructions on how you go from being a child into an adult and some of the rituals involved there. And of course, rituals are usually highly symbolic and have great meaning in the society. And it also denotes a real increase in the type of responsibilities you have and the expectations of society. And it makes it very clear to everyone what side you're on because you've now gone through those rituals and are on the other side of things. So the law is really just a set of guidelines about the relations between how individuals fit in with society and the divine and religious beliefs. Unfortunately, what we begin to see is the law is starting to break down due to globalization. But the reason it was so important is that it was premised on how their society is going to operate and how their society is perpetuated. And so these collectivistic beliefs where one person looks after another and that you sacrifice the individual for the good of the whole, really important and goes to the core of that society succeeding. But as I was mentioning just a moment ago, as globalization has increased, you begin to see the relationship between adolescents and the law start to break down. And that has caused their society to break down considerably too, because you have these kind of dueling influences, and to the point maybe adolescents don't want to go through the law to kind of learn all of this. And that's how you begin to see a culture break down. Now, just because you think, oh, these are Aborigines in Australia, a long way from us, we've always had an individualistic society. Well, don't have to go back too far to realize that that's not the case. So another example that your book uses is something called Middletown. And it was two studies that were done roughly 50 years apart, one right at the end of the 1920s, and then another one in 1982. So Middletown, which is actually Muncie, Indiana, what they wanted to do is look at how did the socialization, or what were the beliefs in broad and narrow socialization over that 50-year period. Did they stay the same, or do they differ or change? And what you can see here in the graph is that you have more collectivistic kind of things that are valued, more narrow socialization back in the 1920s in Muncie or Middletown. So loyalty to church, strict obedience, these are the things that are highly valued, much more so than independence or tolerance of people's differences. Now you look 50 years later, in which the United States went through tremendous amounts of industrialization and became much more affluent than they were 50 years earlier, and you see just the flip from a kind of collectivistic type of culture to a more individualistic culture, where now independence and tolerance, because if you got a lot of independent people, you have to be pretty tolerant of what they do. And that tolerance also taps into a broader socialization sort of fix. So you see these changes in societies. Just because a society starts out one way doesn't mean that they won't convert to another. And to some extent, you're seeing a little bit of this in Japan, where you see maybe some more individualistic mindsets start to begin in a very collectivistic culture. And so that's something to kind of ponder as we are going to transition next to Module 4, which focuses on cultural beliefs within what we call a custom complex.